Welcome, everyone. We will get started here in just a couple minutes as everyone files in. All right, so thank you so much for joining me today. We will be talking about making the show garden at our display garden for the Northwest Flower and Garden Show that we just completed. I guess it's been almost a month now. Going through that as a case study and talking about how to establish vision and goals for your garden space. So before we jump into the actual show garden, every well-designed garden starts with a vision, essentially answering the questions who, what, when, where, and why. So the context of the garden is what provides the boundaries or bumpers to stay within. As you will see with our display garden, the gathering garden, I drew outside the lines a little bit because what better opportunity than on a showroom floor where fences and property lines don't exist. A lot of show gardens you typically see as, some version of a square, rectangle, maybe there's a couple corners cut off, but they're usually uh, pretty boring exterior shapes, and I wanted to change that up a little bit, do something a little bit different. So you will see that. But in an actual garden, you are typically confined to a pretty standard shape with existing elements, your surroundings, fences, property lines, all of that. Next is function. How will the space be used? How does it need to function? What connection points need to be made? What views need to be managed either by restricting or enhancing, and how many people will be using that space, and what are their needs, and how does that space need to serve them? Next is the elements. So this is the laundry list of items that you either want for your own garden, or if you're a designer, the items that your client is requesting. What is on the agenda? Is it patios, fire pits, pools, hot tubs, pergolas, decks, seating, retaining walls, vegetable gardens, artwork, you name it. There's so many elements that can be incorporated into a garden. And then lastly, how does it all need to look? What style fits the context of the home, the client, the local environment? Again, for a show garden, this boundary is all made up. There are no clues to take from the architecture of a home. There's no color palette from the interior to bring out into the garden. We get to choose whatever we want, which is kind of twofold, great and also a little bit overwhelming because it can be anything. So before we jump into the gathering garden, I want to pause here to give you a little bit of something to think about. If you're a homeowner, you will be asking these questions of yourself. And if you're a designer, you will be asking these questions of your clients. Gardens are not stagnant. The question needs to be asked not only what do you want now, but how will it or can it grow with you to achieve your future needs as well? This can take into account multiple factors. It can be kids maturing and growing up, aging adults, transitioning in just life transitions. So, like starting a new family, retiring, being busy, building a career. Each season of life will have different demands, and a garden can create a space that supports those needs, but it can also be something that transitions and grows as the needs of the garden owner change as well. When I'm working with my clients, I ask a lot of questions about how they use the space, what's working, what's not working, how they would like to use the space, like what's their ideal conditions, how many people they entertain, and how much space do they want to accommodate for certain elements, certain aspects of the garden, especially clients that have younger kids. Usually that's a big focus, but how can that space transition from the needs of the toddler to early elementary stage into those teen years? How can that space serve both without having to be a completely redesign or reconfiguring of the space? And then what current restrictions they have that might change in the future. So, the Gathering Garden is the name of the show garden that we created for the Northwest Flower and Garden Show this year. The vision for this garden was to create a space for a family to gather together. Because the show floor did not have an actual client nor a property or home, we got the opportunity to create a fictitious client and setting by which we informed the garden design. We wanted this garden to showcase how a space would be designed to meet current needs of a family with younger kids while providing a pleasant and functional space for adults, and grow with the family to create a space where the kids, as teens, would invite their friends to hang out, eat some pizza, play in the pool, enjoy late nights around the fire eating s'mores, you name it. Every parent of teens knows that you want to be the home that your kids and all of their friends gather at. As we started to sketch things out and start dreaming about this space, we gathered a lot of inspirational images and wish list of elements for materials to include. The next couple slides do show a lot of that. It has been edited and kind of pared down as we kind of worked through the design. This really is kind of that dreaming stage. So as we acquired features, some of these items you'll see actually got included in the final garden. Initially, there were a lot of other elements that they got kind of brought in or axed, or maybe it's something where we've got two different ideas. It could be this or it could be this. I pared that down a little bit to ease some of the confusion on why didn't that end up happening. But the vision for the Gathering Garden was to create a crisp, modern, sleek hardscape design with touches of color and light to soften and enhance the features. And then, of course, plant material softens everything. Creating a vision board of sorts is a super helpful exercise, both for homeowners and for designers. I often have clients that have Pinterest boards that they share with me. And this is fabulous because I can look at what they have pinned and see what they find appealing. Often, there are a lot of clues of what they really want by reading in between the lines of what they've selected. For example, sometimes a client's Pinterest board will include a lot of modern gardens, but they've told me that they don't like modern design. Maybe it's not the modern that they find appealing, but the simplicity and the order. It can be hard to find exactly what you're looking for when perusing Pinterest or anywhere on the internet for that matter. And sometimes clients have a hard time verbalizing the style that they're looking for and what appeals to them most. So rather than trying to ask for something that is exactly what they want, sometimes it's easier to direct clients or yourself to just find things that you find appealing and just get a huge array of visuals that all speak to you in some way or another. And then looking at the gamut of that, then you can start to see some of those themes and that carry through, whether it's color, texture, organization. Symmetry is a big one that I look for in Pinterest boards of my clients. And even when I'm doing a design where I don't have that visual feedback from a client, I still create that for myself when designing. I'll look at different things. I'll grab pictures from past projects. I'll grab material samples to just kind of start putting that palette together and those visuals that really help create that vision that can be carried through the entire design. So as we're talking about elements and forms, there's a lot of things that were explored when creating the vision and ideas for the Gathering Garden. We explored a lot of different elements, forms, layouts. We sketched into the concepts as we gathered more and more ideas. One of the hard things about the show garden is narrowing those ideas down. There is a big temptation to do everything and cram all the ideas into the space. No one's telling you no. There isn't the same budget constraints as a real garden. There is a budget, but it's different. And sometimes it's hard to really kind of pare down those ideas and keep a consistent theme because you want to do a little bit of everything. And so after many sketches, I had to sit back and analyze and edit. And I did find some ideas that I was just really forcing too much that didn't need to be included and really would have been something that took away from the overall garden. And so that is where for a homeowner, a designer really comes in to be helpful because they don't get that same emotional connection to the space as the homeowner does. They can see it with fresh eyes. They haven't lived in the space, so they don't see it in the same way. And so sometimes that outsider perspective is really what it takes. And as designers, we work really hard to train ourselves to be able to kind of separate ourselves from the space a little bit, to really be able to step back and analyze and see what's really going to work, what's really going to function the best and look the best, and having that vision for getting from point A of the wants, wishes, and needs and dreaming stage to what reality will be is a really good talent to have. And sometimes homeowners have a hard time because you do get a little too emotionally attached to certain things that maybe need to move or maybe need to go away to create that final vision. So here's a few more elements like art and the plant palette that would balance out all of the hardscaping that started to take shape. But really, the planting plan was the very last thing to come to fruition for the Gathering Garden. A lot of which was because of the time that the show garden gets installed is February. And so there is a much more limited palette of what is available and what looks good and what things can actively be forced to look their best during the season that the show is hosted. So I did so many sketches. Usually for a client, I will do anywhere from 4 to 6 sketches that end up getting turned into 2 presented concept plans. For the Gathering Garden, I probably did at least 30 sketches as I worked through different ideas, shapes, materials, arrangements. As the ideas started to come together, I began to refine it into a final layout. And you can see some of these sketches are a little bit messier. Some of them start to kind of really refine the ideas a little bit more. And then a lot of them have all of the same elements that made the final inclusion, but they're all a little bit different than what we had before or than what actually ended up happening. So as I sketched and edited items, I kept coming back to that vision statement and the inspiration photos as a checkpoint or a filter of sorts to keep me from going off on a tangent and to really keep that vision very clear and concise. So this is the final-ish layout and the first 3D model that was completed to this point. From here, modifications were made as elements and materials became more refined. And then you can see in this one, more materials, more elements, and plants coming into view, starting to develop the ideas of where specific specimen plants will be, where we're going to be able to incorporate other plant material that can be uplit to really create that balance of light and texture and height balance as well. Another view just from the ground plane, kind of looking at some of the spaces, and we've got a lot of repetition of shapes and patterns that really are more apparent when you see the photos of the actual garden. They're not as apparent in the SketchUp model that we did, but we'll be able to look at that in a minute. I've got a lot of photos. So here's a little, we did a little bit more editing up to this point. And one thing that did get edited out that was in all of the initial 3D renderings was this tall blue pot. I really wanted it to be incorporated, but I came to the realization that I was really forcing it too much. And it was really something that was going to be blocking and distracting from the view to the deck, to the pool, and really a distraction to the beautiful glass art. And so this pot ended up getting cut from the final design and implementation. And I really didn't feel like it was missed at all. I think it was a really great design choice to choose to eliminate that element. And it allowed things to really be a lot more open because I wanted that structure to be a beautiful open gateway to the space, and the cadence of having that kind of offset the balance of the whole space a little bit. So to keep on a budget for a show garden, there's a lot of different things that designers and installers do. And one of those is sourcing as many materials from items that we either already have or items that can be borrowed or donated. And so a lot of the plant material we borrowed. Um, a lot of the elements like the fire pit, like the stone seat rocks that we've got here, oh, those are all borrowed. And then we got great donations as well, which really made a big difference. And not all just based on my relationships. This also relied on installers and collaborators' relationships as well. It was one of my installers that actually helped get the donation for this beautiful tiger wood decking that we used. My carpenter's preferred supplier was able to donate that material to the garden because of the relationship that they had, which was fantastic. And it really made a big difference in the garden. And isn't it gorgeous? So there are a few elements that neither me or my contractor had done before. And thankfully, we had the space in his shop to pre-build much of it and work out all the kinks ahead of time. That really made a big difference when it came to the installation phase as well. So two of those elements that took a lot of kinks to work out were the sliding mechanism of the deck, because the whole deck slides over the pool to cover it. You can see we've got a rail system kind of mocked up here, and then you can see the hardware in the far left picture that we ended up mounting to the bottom side of the deck to allow it to slide smoothly. And then the pop-up lounge chairs was another thing that took a little bit of work to get exactly how we wanted it. So not only in figuring out the exact angle that was the most comfortable, but also in the mechanism for how the hinge points would work the best. And we went through a couple different hinges that really, to make it as sleek and slim and seamless as possible. There's a couple different options that we went through finding the right hinge, which really worked out lovely in the end. And then we also had some elements that were made specifically for the garden. So the glass work is one of those, and you can see here at the glass worker's shop where he's creating these gorgeous glasswork for the specific garden. So really tying into the colors, the theme, the style that we had in that grand vision for the garden. And you can see the fire pit here I brought to his studio. He made the glass pieces, then we pre-fit everything to make sure that he had the right amount and the right height and shape and size for all of those pieces that made up that faux fire, because the convention center would never let us light a real fire inside. So we created the faux fire using his beautiful glasswork. And then next you can see more pre-building. We're starting to select some plant material. We've got the arbor mocked up, which is, at this point you can see, it's not completely leveled out and everything. We're working on making sure that we've got the bracing in the right places on the bottom of it so that it can just sit on a concrete floor without having a footing like it would in a real garden. And then the outdoor shower took a little bit more finesse to get it plumbed and working, because obviously you're going to have different plumbing available in a show garden than you will in an actual garden. So making sure that we've got that dialed in so that we can get it mounted and set up so that we're not having to fiddle with that too much once the show build starts. And then showtime. So this is us getting, first dibs onto the show floor when we started building. You can see some of the gardens in the background have already started construction. We were on the very end, so we were one of the last start times, because they do allow big semis and deliveries of large materials to actually drive in onto the show floor to drop off. And there's skid steers driving everywhere with mulch and with boulders and dropping off pallets of material to all the gardens. You can see our plant delivery that came in. If you look closely, you can see our kind of outskirt line of where the show garden got laid out on the show floor with tape. And then the entire garden was measured out and drawn out on the floor with chalk, working within that space. And I did this about 4 times to get it just right. I won't get into the drama, but we did have to make some unexpected changes as we were laying out, because some things had changed on the garden floor that we didn't know about. But that added a couple extra chalk line exercises to the whole gamut, but it all worked out. And then even just staging and logistics of all of this, moving all the pieces around, making sure that staging of pallets is done in a way that they don't have to move multiple times, and keeping materials as close as possible to kind of keep things moving quickly. But again, trying to keep things out of everybody's way at the same time. And so this wall, the main wall of the garden, had to be built first for like the rock to be placed, and then it had to be built before the decking could go in. So there's a big cadence to how all of the materials are orchestrated to really get everything to run smoothly and to make sure that everything's going along in an organized and efficient manner, especially in a tight confined space with so many different builds happening at the same time that are not on the same timeline as you. So that really complicates the whole install process. And we only get 3 days to install. So it really needs to go like clockwork. To make the build go smoother, you can see here that I printed a plan that extrapolated each layer of block. That way the crew had a map for each layer to make things go in really quickly. A couple details that aren't super clear here is that I left a gap in the blocks under the stairs for extension cord access and lighting wire to sneak through. And that way we could attach everything easily because our power source was on the very far end of the garden. And also in the design, I designed in a storage box in the back corner of the garden that's really not visible and not accessible to the public, that served as a great place to stash watering cans, hoses, coats, backpacks, lunch, you name it, during the show. So we had a nice, secure, out of sight place. You're not having to kind of find a spot, in amongst where everyone's walking and moving around all the time to stash those items. Then that leading wall, like I'd mentioned, had to be built first. And you can see here where that wall really was the hinge point of the whole garden construction, because that wall had to be built before we could place that one boulder that we showed. But then it also had to be built first so that the rail for the sliding deck could be mounted before the deck could come in. And so this wall really was the key thing keeping everything else in the garden moving forward. So we started there. Once it was completed, the woodworking started going in and the crew shifted focus to the blocks on the other side of the patio to make space for the carpenters to work on the woodworking aspects. Even though that wall didn't get completed around that whole upper tier, we got the wall completed enough for the woodworking to go in, and then shifted gears for the installers working on the block into the other side. And because all of the woodworking was pre-built, it went in like Legos, which was fantastic. And the carpentry crew was in and out in a matter of hours. Our initial schedule, we had penciled the carpentry crew to be in for half of the first day and then half of the second day. And they finished everything within that first half of the first day, so that they didn't have to come back, which was great. It allowed them to spend less time, less energy on parking and getting down to the convention center, and everything just went in really smoothly, which was just delightful. And so because we had those 2 separate sections of the garden, we were able to work on finishing touches on one end of the garden while the other side still had all of that heavy lifting to do. The wall was completed on the far side, and we started to bring in mulch and plants so that we could start finishing up that edge. Well, the other pieces were still fitting together. This allowed us to really capitalize on the volunteers that helped out with the garden, which was fantastic. So the craftsmen and crew doing the heavy lifting were on one end and volunteers were on the other. And it allowed everyone to kind of keep working smoothly and efficiently without kind of running into each other and stepping on each other's toes because it's so many people in such a small space. Here are some more action shots. One thing you'll see here is the felt covering everything to keep it as clean as possible. This saved a lot of time because in a actual garden, you can just come in and you can pressure wash everything when you're done. In the convention center, we don't have that capability. We had to scrub everything with sponges and buckets and brushes, and we can't use water just hosing everything off like you can in a real garden. So some of those logistical factors had to come into play. And you can even see we have felt even covering the top of the walls as the plant material is being placed. We've got the plastic still on all of the light fixtures to keep them clean so that we don't have to wash them and wipe them down later. And that really helped with keeping everything efficient, getting us in and out of there in a really smooth amount of time as well. You can see here kind of the different stages of how things were being completed. You can see areas of the garden that are almost done, and then you can see areas of the garden that still have very little plants and aren't even in the stages of cleaning up. And so you can see how we're working on all of those different areas in a kind of a different timeline and a different cadence because of the areas that just really had a lot of elements going on at once, and the areas that were more simple that could be finished quicker and gotten out of the way while the heavy lifting on the other end is happening. And then as we keep moving along, so we've got almost everything done at this point in these photos. Now that the garden was put together, now the work on cleaning, watering. Yes, all of those plants need watered multiple times during the show. And then we needed to fill the pool at this time still. Still have a lot of plant primping, placing plant tags, making sure that everything is in its place. We're still popping in a few extra bulbs and forced color at that point. You can also see in this photo, we're starting to set the glasswork, which was one of the last things that came in. And then here we are almost complete, just kind of dialing in some items. You can see there's still boom lifts in the back working on the theater lighting above. And then here you can see the glass going in. This was the last element to arrive because we wanted to make sure that everything was pretty much done when it arrived so that no one bumped into it. It's super durable, but we don't want any broken glass. And it's just gorgeous. And that way everything was in its place. All the furniture was placed at that point so that when he came in to set those pieces, that was really the finishing touch. That was the icing on the cake. And you can see here, it's hard to see in some of the pictures, but you can see those twinkle lights in amongst the glass of the fire. I wish I had a video of it, but it really allowed for more of a flickering flame type effect to happen with that glass art in person that you can't see in pictures. And then you can see the crew to the left here getting prepped to aim all of the overhead theater lighting. So we filled out forms, gosh, 6, 7 months in advance before the show on what we had in terms of need for overhead lighting. Obviously, we've got a lot of landscape lighting, but overhead lighting, because we don't have natural sunlight, we had to know what style, what temperature, what effect for the lighting, and then specific areas that we wanted to be highlighted so that they could have those fixtures mounted ahead of time. And then all they had to do was just aim, adjust, lighten things up, darken things down, working with us once we had everything complete. And it was really nice that we had the garden completed at this stage so that we could turn all of our lighting on and see where those pieces were, where we needed a little bit more overhead light to mimic that natural light that you would have if it were outdoors. And here Colleen and I are enjoying a minute to sit down now that the garden is complete, which was fantastic. We just finished sweeping again and again and again, getting all of the pillows and staging items placed. And it was really great to just have a minute to relax and enjoy the garden and get to sit and get off of our feet for a minute. And then a couple more shots around the garden. One thing I want to point out here in the photo on the lower right is these planted gaps in the wall where it meets that beautiful boulder. The block was purchased by my contractor with the intention that he will use it on a future job. So I really wanted to make sure that we didn't create any pieces that would go to waste and not be able to be reused. Rather than cutting blocks to fill this gap, it opened up the perfect opportunity to soften these edges with plants, and it kept all of the block able to be reused. The funny thing is my contractor kept on telling me, "No, it's not a big deal. Like it's one block. We'll cut a block. It's not a problem." And then after he saw it, he's like, "Oh, that actually looks so much better. It looks so nice." He's like, I see what you see now." And so it's really, it's about those elements that really sometimes the confining factors can be some of the most beautiful elements in a space. And so as a homeowner, sometimes it's hard to get hung up on those things. As a designer, we know that we can really get creative when we hit those roadblocks and hit those things that might not be exactly what we wanted, but really like this little element made a huge difference in the way that this whole corner kind of came together with all of the materials that we've got coming into play and then softening those edges. We've even got, some hens and chicks softening along that bottom border where the rock doesn't sit perfectly level on the floor, because normally it would be buried in soil and you wouldn't see what that bottom edge looks like. But rather than have to find a rock that has a cut edge on the bottom that sat exactly how we wanted, we just used a natural boulder in all of its beauty and placed shims and 2x4s underneath of it to get it to sit exactly how we wanted, and then just tucked in little succulents and hens and chicks around it to fill in those little beautiful gaps. Here's some more pictures. You can start to see that plant palette, how that comes together, and using some of those rich jewel tones really very heavily with some differentiating textures and forms to really create a nice palette that focuses on a lot of green with some very intentional pops of color. And this view, actually the bottom right and the far left picture is actually an area of the garden that is one of my favorite views, but it's not viewable to the public because it's up against that back curtain. But it's just like this little secret space where you can really kind of get an almost intrusive view into the garden, where it's not a view that you would ever have unless you're maintaining a space. And there's all kinds of little spaces that get created like that in a real garden as well, where when you live in live in the space and get to use the space, and even just while you're maintaining it, you see different aspects of the garden that you don't always see if you're just sitting in the space. So I like some of those photos just for that reason. And then here's a couple more views. You can see from the backside now that view from the beautiful Stewardia tree that is centered on the arbor structure, and kind of how that transitions that space to the deck that slides over the pool. You can see in the bottom picture, you can kind of see that rail a little bit on the wall where that slides. And then you can see into the far other side of the garden along this angled access point through the space. And the lighting details in the garden are my second favorite element. So the first being those gorgeous pop-up lounge chairs that were super comfortable, admittedly a little difficult to get in and out of, but it's totally worth it. They're super comfortable and really fun. And I love the dynamic use of space and the ability to really have versatile spaces. But the track lighting in the patio turned into a really great detail. And those gaps were actually born just based on sheer function in planning for logistical tweaks. Because I did not want to cut any of the block, I also did not want to cut any of those beautiful porcelain pavers that we used for the patio. And so, to keep from having to do that, I designed in these two gaps, and they allowed for any discrepancy in measurements or angles to be discreetly dealt with. A little fudge factor is super important, especially with confined spaces and rigid materials. The cobble in those joints covers most of the track lighting and then we dispersed just a little bit of clear and teal glass to really bring that light up through the pebble and make a beautiful like twinkle light effect. And also hard to show here, but we added twinkle lights to the base of the flame glass that you could see a little bit better in that previous picture while we were installing the glass, but it really made it more flame-like. So we're using light in a lot of different ways in this garden. You can see the underlighting on the floating stairs, very subtle, but great for late into the evening. And then the little bit of track lighting, kind of creating that twinkle effect, along with more traditional lighting with path lights and uplights on elements. And in terms of kind of how this idea of this joint could be used in a practical application, for small gardens, especially like inner city, you got the postage stamp lot where every quarter of an inch really counts. Having some spaces that really allow for some, kind of shifting and adjustment is really key because not everything is going to fit exactly per plan. No fence line is going to be completely square. No wall is going to be completely square. And so there's always those elements where you do need a little bit of an area where you can kind of transition things a little bit so that if you do have things that don't match exactly perfectly, it's not going to be something that creates a visual distraction or is, for someone like me, like the first thing I see is that, that one piece of tile that's out of alignment. And so those little factors in there that allow you to mind those gaps and keep things looking like everything's perfectly aligned are huge, especially in small gardens. Not as necessary in, large gardens. I work on a lot of gardens that are multiple acres. And so you've got a lot more elbow room. You've got a lot more room to kind of shift and adjust things. And you don't have to be as precise on every single thing. But small gardens, every little detail matters. And that precision makes a big difference. Even when you're talking about natural materials, a bluestone patio is not going to be as precise as these porcelain pavers. These porcelain pavers have a threshold allowance that's much, much smaller than a natural material does. And so if we were to do the same garden on the show floor with a bluestone, we would not have been able to lay it directly on felt on the show floor because you would have seen those height discrepancies. You need a little bit of wiggle room depending on the materials, depending on the style and the layout. So understanding the restrictions of your materials and how the design feeds or supports those restrictions really is an important aspect to make sure that you're creating a space that feels the way and looks the way that you want. Kind of, again, carrying through that vision, that clean, crisp, very smooth, sleek, modern design wouldn't have been the same if we had really irregular shaped materials and gaps that were a little bit more erratic and not as precise and refined looking. So this is one of my favorite views of the entire garden. And unfortunately, I didn't even know that this area was accessible until the last day of the show. But this is actually a view from a unused office space in a second floor, right adjacent, obviously, to our garden in the convention center. It really shows that finished product compared to the original design, and it shows the balance of the color, the space, the light, and all of the forms that we tied in and brought together in the garden. You can see the dynamic and versatile details of the garden, and you can see that repetition of, we've got the three arbors with the three strips of pavers in the patio. We've got the three landing stairs. We've got the three planters. We've got that same kind of offset vertical lines being repeated in the arbor as we have in the pattern on the planters. And then that same pattern is turned on edge and repeated in the block wall. So we've got a lot of repetition of very similar style and feel and line work that are repeated through the whole garden. And you can just, from this space, like you can see there are multiple spaces to play, to gather, to entertain. I can envision our fictitious family client as it was designed for using the space. You've got the young kids in the pool while the mom and her friend lounge on the deck getting some sun. The older kids can gather around the fire pit, leaving the cushy chairs for their grandparents while their dad cooks up some pizza on the other side of the garden. The arbor really is that piece that creates a transition between the spaces. And like I mentioned before, I wanted it to be open but frame the view. I didn't want it to be something blocking or something that felt like too much of a narrowed gateway. I wanted it to be something where you really felt like it was drawing you up and into that upper space. And the garden space on the left of the patio wraps around a large portion of the patio to give it that feeling of seclusion and privacy and kind of that cozy backdrop, even though in a show garden, nothing's secluded or private. But this showcases how that vision can be brought to life, how the spaces can transition, and you can host everyone. For example, in a larger gathering, those lounge chairs on the deck can be folded down flat, and you can bring in a table for 4 if you needed a different dining experience or more seating. The fire pit could be easily capped for a serving table if it was too hot out for a fire. And then the deck can then be rolled over the pool if you need to keep it out of sight for little ones. Everyone around little kids knows the best way to eliminate a distraction or a desire for little ones is to keep it out of sight. So that's a great way to just be able to slide it. It covers the pool. It'll keep it clean, keep flying leaves out if it's in the winter, or if you've got little ones that you don't want in the pool on a certain day, you can do that as well. So there's all of these different uses and ways that the space can transition and work with not only, day-to-day different changes, but also life changes as the garden owner kind of goes through different seasons of life with ages of kids and family and lifestyle. So as we wrap up, we will open it up for questions. For those designers in the group watching, the next design class is going to be April 29th. That is to review contracts, billing, and estimating. And I will include a sign-up link when I send out the recording. Any designers that do love podcasts and don't already tune in, be sure to check out my podcast, The Process Driven Designer. It's available on almost every podcast listening app. I talk a lot about running a design business, tactics for efficiency and profitability as a designer. And I also interview some really fabulous people, from designers to contractors, material suppliers, that have so much knowledge to share. It's really fun. And then for those homeowners, if you are interested in having us design your garden, the best way to reach out is through our client questionnaire on our website contact page. The link will also be included in the recording email that you will receive. We really focus on, hence, gathering gardens. We want to create spaces for residential landscapes that really focus heavily on usable, functional, beautiful spaces in gardens. And we do everything from pools, patios, pergolas, you name it. We really love to create spaces that really allow homeowners to use and love and gather in those spaces and really get a lot of joy and excitement out of their garden spaces. Even if you're not an avid gardener, using that outdoor space is really what it's all about. And then I also offer for designers business coaching. I already talked about the classes, and I also do speaking engagements as well. So we will open it up for questions. Feel free to chime in on the chat to ask your question, or you can unmute yourself and chime in that way as well.